Well, I'm delighted to be here talking to Giles James, who works with ID Wines. Giles, would you like to just give yourself a little bit of an introductory
Sure.
biography?
Yeah. So I've been involved in wine, I guess, for over 20 years. I started off working in that sort of very traditional distribution model, working with restaurants in London.
Mhm.
But around 2011, I wanted to sort of get a bit of insight into the other side of the fence, working with winemakers.
Mhm.
So I set up a company around 2011, 2014 to actually be able to work with various producers, helping them build their distribution across other time zones in countries
Mhm.
that I was based in, so primarily UK, Europe, and Scandinavia. And then that sort of organically grew into working with restaurants as a consultant wine buyer and also training their teams. Um, and that in turn has led to me sort of doing a few own label projects and actually importing and doing the wholesale and distribution on behalf of a number of clients. So all very much wine related, but
Mhm.
sort of quite diverse in their own fields of interest.
Mhm.
Um, and that has naturally led me on to sort of looking into sustainability. So for me at the moment, things like, what are more innovative ideas that the wine industry can be doing as a whole
Mhm.
to bring added value to restaurants or bars or pubs, whatever they might be. And so that whole area of sort of canned wine, wine and keg,
Mhm.
um, and looking at the finer points of detail about sourcing is
Mhm.
all very, very close to my heart.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, we're going to drill down into a bit of that detail. So I've got some questions to ask you about kind of sustainability in the wider industry. But any of that stuff you can pull out about the sort of the pubs and the bars that you work with, that would be brilliant. So the first question is really around sort of impactful change. So can you tell us a little bit about what's the most impactful, but perhaps less publicised operational changes that pubs, bars, or restaurants that you've worked with could implement to reduce environmental
Yeah,
footprint?
yeah. I think it's a really, really broad area that of that
Yeah,
question encompasses
it
because
is.
it
Yeah.
really goes to the heart of what does it mean to be sustainable and what does it mean
Mm,
to have, all these processes in place that
mm,
reduce your impact on the environment.
yeah.
And I think, if you take an example of an operator that wants to transition into that,
Mm,
it's costly, it takes time, and there's quite a few people you've got to convince to
mm,
sort of buy into why you should be doing it when it comes at potentially at a great cost to the business.
yeah.
But if some of the behind the scenes things that I think any operator could do, probably first and foremost, is get in touch with the Sustainable Restaurant Association.
Mm-hmm.
These guys started in 2010, I think it was, and
Yeah.
they're now global and they're there to advise and help restaurants as a charity organization
Mm-hmm.
as to how they can conduct themselves better.
Mm-hmm.
So it's taking an existing model and it's going in and drilling into the detail and sort of working from very clear pillars to say, right, for example, what can you do about waste? What can you do about recycling? What can you do about logistics?
Mm-hmm.
So, if you wanted a few sort of things that you could do immediately, I think one of the most simplest things you can do is through your buying.
Yeah.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
take your wine list, for
Yeah.
example, introduce key keg.
Mm-hmm.
That cuts down on, each key keg cuts down on almost 27 glass bottles.
Mm-hmm.
That has a positive impact on the logistics because you can ship more wine
Yeah.
for cheaper
Yeah.
and reduce your carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
So all the way through your supply chain, through to your customers'
Mm-hmm.
experience, there's a degree of saving every step of the way.
Yeah.
Moving from bottled spirits to buying pouches
Mm-hmm.
and refilling bottles. Working with some good cocktail companies to do pre-made cocktails that come in pouches
Mm-hmm.
that you can put into bottles. So you're just cutting down on all of that spirit, all of that wastage. I'd say that those are just a couple
Yeah, and
of
there's a
things
win
that
at
people
the
can do.
there's a win at the other end, isn't there, with, you know, being able to sort of say to staff on the front line of those venues, you'll get to save some time as well. There's no more kind of time
Yeah,
wasted opening
yeah,
bottles and then the weight of the,
yeah,
so
yeah.
so
And there
that
is a,
makes
you know,
sense.
it's.
Mm,
I think, I mean, there is absolutely a cost impact to some of the things that you can do. You know, if you take, for example, sourcing food,
mm,
you know, there is an added cost to buying locally
yeah.
and working with local producers. But I think there's, you know, we'll probably get onto this later, but, you know, there is an element of goodwill
Yeah.
that people will buy into and they'll understand it. Some people won't get it, but other
Mm,
people will. And I think you know, by engaging and sourcing cleverly,
mm,
if you take, for example, spirits, there is a cost saving.
mm-hmm,
So it isn't, so one thing will balance off the other. You know,
mm-hmm.
if your cost of produce is costing more, but your cost of booze is costing less, then maybe one underwrites the other, and
Yeah.
there's a bit of an equilibrium
Mm-hmm.
that you sort of come out of balance.
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
you're looking for balance.
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. Um, and I mean, this is quite a tricky question, really, but how do you think hospitality businesses can actually measure their success in terms of what they're doing on their journey towards kind of sustainable
Yeah,
practices? Really
I
tricky.
look again. I've worked with um, a pub that set out from day one to be sustainably minded.
Mm,
And their goal is to reduce their reliance on carbon credits each year.
yeah.
So whatever they can do in the following year to reduce it, that becomes their modus
Yeah.
operandi. And they signed up to a organization that measures your carbon footprint
Mm-hmm.
and then tells you whether your what your sort of net carbon credit needs to be, and they go out and buy that.
Mm,
But that costs quite a lot of money. And again, they've done it from day one. So everything's been set up for that program. So I think if an outlet or a group or, you know, whatever the size of the operation is, you can internally start measuring, you know, how much, if we are transitioning from bottles to pouches,
yeah.
how much glass are we saving? You know, can we upcycle anything within our system that we
Yeah.
can bring back and reuse?
Yeah.
So, you know, instead of throwing bottles away, maybe
Mm-hmm.
we keep them for water,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe we turn them into carafes for wine.
Mm,
And you know, and I think, you know, AI has got quite a bit to play with this in terms of food waste.
mm.
But, you know, again, that's probably something we'll get into later. And it, again, that's sort of quite a big cost to a business. So I think, you know, if you can reduce your reliance on blue roll, I mean, restaurants go through
Yeah.
umpteen rolls of this,
Yeah.
you know, and I
Yeah.
think there's an opportunity to incentivize your staff,
Mm-hmm.
you know, so they proactively get on board and go,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I want to take responsibility for this, because I think young people engage in this dialogue and conversation a lot better than older generations. Um, and looking at your logistics, you know, looking at your supply chain,
Mm-hmm.
do you go out and work with suppliers that use electric vehicles? So even though it's not something that's directly being created out of your site,
Mm.
there is background things going on as well.
Yeah.
So you can say, well, actually, we've reduced our carbon footprint because our supply chain has gone electric,
Mm.
you know, or reducing the number of orders you do per week. So you can easily keep a tally of, right, we ordered fruit and vegetables 3 times this week.
Mm.
Let's see if we can cut it down to 2.
Yeah.
And again, so those are all measures and things that a site can take on board
Yeah.
themselves
Yeah.
and measure themselves
Yeah.
and reward their staff for doing it, and you know,
Yeah.
and that's at no cost.
Yeah. And it feels very holistic.
Yeah,
It feels as if, you know, that's a sort of approach that everyone connected to the business can engage with
yeah,
and feel a part of,
yeah,
rather than sort of just having an external audit, which is very useful, but you know, it adds to the sense of like everybody has something to contribute and they can see it happening.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think, yeah. So I think it's taking those measures,
Yeah.
because an external audit is great, but
Yeah.
I think it could be quite depressing if you're transitioning
Yeah.
and you get these guys in, they're like, well,
Yeah.
there's your score,
Yeah.
and you're
So
like, well,
far.
it's
Yeah.
kind of it
Yeah.
could be demoralizing.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, if you take some measures in and get yourself and set yourself some targets. I think it can be fun, and it's something you can talk to your customer base about.
Definitely. In an era of greenwashing, which we all know happens perhaps far too often, what specific metrics do you think a hospitality brand can employ to build and maintain sort of real credibility, so that they're not seen by people as simply sort of ticking a box, and sort of really engaging with that holistic approach that we just spoke about?
I think it fundamentally has to come down to your core values and ethos as a business. So that any time that you're projecting yourself to the outside world, any claim that you make can be followed and traced back to this core essential value. So, you don't have to come out with this all-embracing, all-encompassing plan. You can say, right, you know what, it's going to be about our supply chain, or it's going to be about our wine list, or it's going to be about sourcing locally. And I think as long as all of your actions stem from that core principle, then if somebody questions it, you're always bringing it back and you go, well, actually, this is how it works. This is where it's come from. There was one of the big sort of supermarkets that said about their chickens that our chickens come from farms. But they dropped the word batch.
Exactly.
And that is just, that's just trying to hoodwink people. And that doesn't take much to investigate. But, I've worked with a wine supplier in the past who, they are actively trying to reduce their carbon footprint. And they do a lot of good work. But one year they came out saying, they put out this press release to say, we're carbon negative. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Let's look a little bit into that. Really bold claim. What it turned out was that they'd overbought their carbon credits.
Right.
So they'd actually, only purely by making a mistake on how many carbon credits they had to buy, they said that's why they went into the negative. And this, that doesn't take much investigation. So, I think for anybody, it has to be a traceable route back to what that core ethos and values of the business.
And being transparent about where you fall short. None of us are perfect.
Absolutely.
I think people prefer that.
I mean, again, just looking at it from the world or the part that I work in wine. I mean, I've tried to write wholly sustainable wine lists, but given the cost of certain things and inputs and climate change having an effect on yields, the cost of wine and the cost of getting things moved around the world, it's costing more. And as much as you use key keg to try and reduce that, bottles of wine are becoming quite expensive when you want to be more sustainable. So at a certain price point in the wine list, sometimes you have to go, we're doing the best that we can. If 95% of the list is ticking the boxes and a little bit isn't, we'll be straight up about that. We're not going to try and hoodwink. So it's the intention.
Yes.
It's the intention to do the best that you can based on your model, based on where you are, based on what you want to achieve, and sticking to that and being honest about it, as you say.
Definitely. And what do you think are sort of the key kind of competitive advantages of integrating sustainability into a hospitality business and the brand identity of that business?
For me, I think there's a lot of goodwill. There's an awful lot of goodwill you get with being sustainable. As I was saying before, some people won't get it, and I think if you're the kind of outlet that's much more of a faster in and out kind of business, people might not get it so much, and they might just perceive it as being expensive because they're not regular enough. They don't understand where you're coming from in your story and engage in it. But I think when it comes down to goodwill, it's goodwill with your staff. With some places I've worked with, when you're employing and saying we're a sustainable outlet and we've got sustainable practices, your quality of staff that you're just going to be meeting are going to be so much better. and they're going to be so much more engaged because they want to support it.
Yeah.
And if you give them the right training and teach them and get them to understand how to communicate why you do what you do, and they take that onto the floor, that's your message getting through to your guests. And then so it's the guests buy into that. If they're going to have to pay a couple of pounds more for something, I think you're going to find that they're going to be a lot more comfortable about that. And there was a group, a gastropub group I worked with many years ago, and they bought quite a lot of foraged mushrooms.
Okay.
And they had a guest come in one night, and they'd made this sort of ragu to go with this pasta, and they poisoned a woman.
Oh my God.
Who was pregnant and a lawyer. So, I mean, on paper, that just looked like an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
And she got in touch with me and said, look, I've been really ill. And so, they obviously did all the due diligence.
Yeah.
And they traced it back to this ragu, and they traced it back to these mushrooms.
Wow.
And they got back to her and they said, look, this is the situation. These are wild forage mushrooms. Yeah. Something slipped through the net. Yeah. We are so sorry.
Yeah.
What do we need to do? And she was like, look, I've been coming to your pub for 4 years. Yeah. I love everything you do.
Yeah.
This is the only time anything's ever happened.
Yeah.
I know what you're trying to achieve. I just wanted you to know, just in case you had other reports coming in, that that this was documented. And she never stopped coming back. She remained. So I think that's a very extreme example of goodwill. But I think it just underlines that thing about principles and ethos as well.
Yeah,
So I think for me that's.
And so we've talked. I think quite a lot about kind of sourcing locally and sustainably. But can you talk a little bit more about sort of integrating sustainability into sort of the guest experience and also the wider kind of community relations? We all know that pubs in particular are the heartstone of communities and have a real part to play in giving back.
Yeah.
But how do you think sort of working sustainably also kind of feeds into that, not just the kind of localized guest experience, but also the wider community?
Yeah. Supporting external projects, I think, is a really good way of sort of expanding beyond what people experience when they come to you. So, I mean, I know some people that put a donation of their profits into organisations that plant trees in developing countries. Yeah. Or other sustainable initiatives, whether it's relating to water or whatever it might be. Yeah. That's putting money into projects. That's a long way away. The guy there's the Pig's Head down in Clapham who they have one of these very clever composting machines that work at quite high heat, but a lot of that heat is once it gets moving, the heat is generated by the actual core of what's been composted. And they have an A-frame shelving unit outside the pub, and they put bags of compost out that they've made. So anybody walking past can just pick up a bag of compost.
It's amazing.
And take it home and use it, and that's just giving a little bit back. Yeah. So it's almost like saying, if you come and eat here, you can now take something home as well.
Absolutely.
It's a slightly different doggy bag. It's a good way of recycling.
That's great. Certainly take use of
and or whether some people have charities that they like to support. Whether you pay £2 for your water and you get unlimited water, and then that £2 goes to Great Ormond Street Hospital. Even though that's not a sustainable thing, it's sustainable in terms of human life.
Yes.
And that's quite a strong sort of way of supporting the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned a little bit earlier on about sort of AI and sort of how that might be utilised. And we know that in hospitality businesses, there are kind of AI-driven waste reduction kind of mechanisms that you can use. But what do you think are the best kind of emerging technologies?
I think I think the best emerging technologies are those that don't put human jobs at risk.
Yes.
So you're using AI or, energy efficiency
Mm-hmm.
to enhance the operation of your business,
Mm-hmm.
to make you cleverer in terms of menu development
Mm-hmm.
for guest experience,
Yeah.
but don't take away somebody being able to work in that position. So, for
Absolutely.
example, if you're a drive-in fast food restaurant
Mm-hmm.
and you have AI taking your orders,
Mm.
you've just taken somebody out of that position.
Yeah.
But if you have cameras over your waste bin that measure the food coming back and that analyzes those dishes, and they're saying, on your pad thai noodle, you're wasting 40% on average, people can change their portion control, which means you've just reduced your waste, which means you've increased your GP, which means somebody is benefiting from that at a table because they're not feeling, oh, this is too much food. And also your bottom line is improving because you're wasting less and buying less, and there's a really positive knock-on effect there. So I think AI in reservation systems for managing bookings and shuffling tables around and looking at the key times people want to come in and saying, right, these are your optimum best times for bookings. Let's try and push that a little bit more. Those are all great, because that is something that aids and helps versus replaces.
Definitely, it's a really important point because you take jobs away from people, that's also affecting your immediate community, isn't it?
Yeah,
and you
exactly.
don't want to have that
Exactly.
impact. So how do you think hospitality businesses might design a guest experience that can kind of actively educate its customers? But the key is, I think, not being too preachy, because nobody wants to go out for a meal and then just sort of be lectured to. So how can they do that in a kind of clever and engaging, but sort of also kind of arm's length type way?
I think it can. It's you've got greenwashing on one hand, which is kind of feeding not false information, but it's not exactly being wholly truthful. And then there's a flip side, which is, let me tell you about your plate of food that you're about to eat. And, it's probably, it's going to be cold by the time someone's finished.
Exactly.
So I think, again, it's about balance and doing it in subtle, effective ways. So I run a number of events with one of my guys that I work with, and we do a series of dinners called Farm to Fork. So we will get the producer in. So, I'm doing one tomorrow with a venison producer. So they get to come in and they get to talk about what they do. It's all evidence-based practices. And they will sit down with a group of 30 people. We'll enjoy a 4-course dinner. I'll pair the wines. So they'll get the story about the sustainability of the wine. But the focus is on the producer. So they get to share their ethos, their principles, why they do what they do, how they got to where they did, their journey. And people get to sit down and have a really fun evening.
Yeah, fantastic.
It's not subjecting people to sort of having to listen to things because they're sitting down. They're eating the food that's come from a regenerative farm where there's good animal husbandry. I also do grape to glass, so we'll have the winemaker come in. So we will actually fit a menu around their wines, and they get to talk about sustainability in their wine. We'll take people to farms. We'll take people to wineries. Give them a day out and let them see, what's going on. And actually, something you mentioned before about wider community. There's some people I know who built their own kitchen garden that allows them at certain points over the year to maybe get around 40% of their vegetables out of their own kitchen garden.
Lovely.
And, opening that up to schools. So school kids can go in. Probably maybe not a good idea to take them to a farm where they're going to see nice animals. Sort of but to see the sort of fruit and vegetable where it comes from, and pulling up a carrot and understanding what's above the ground and seeing what's below the ground and getting their heads around that. I think that's a really nice way of embracing sort of what you do and letting people come and see it and experience it firsthand, whether they're children or grown people.
Yeah, and what I love about that is that all those examples you've given are really positive stories and linked to kind of very positive emotions in
Yeah.
the people that are engaging. I love the farm to fork thing, by the way. Wangle an imitation out of that. But I think it's really good to tell that story in a really positive way, rather than sort of making people feel guilty,
Yeah.
or talking to them about kind of like some of the more distressing stuff. Because at the end of the day, people are going for a pleasant night out or for a
Absolutely.
pleasant experience,
Absolutely.
and yeah, I think hospitality businesses do have to balance that.
Yeah,
don't
and
they?
look, you know,
Yeah.
when the Pig's Head very first opened,
Mm.
their menu was probably 70% weighted towards vegan and vegetarianism,
Okay.
and their clientele base complained. So they were like, well,
Yeah.
we're trying to sort of, or they thought this is what
Yeah.
people want. This is how we want to project ourselves.
Yeah.
But actually, the feedback that came back was,
Okay.
we actually want to eat some meat
Yeah.
because you're known for great produce
Yeah.
and great meat.
Yeah.
So that led them to go out and do
Mhm.
work with regenerative farmers
Mhm.
and sourcing locally.
Great.
And you know, they buy in
Mm.
the side of a lamb
Mhm.
and they butcher it on site, and so the menu is dictated to by wherever they are on that animal at that
Yeah.
time, as opposed to buying 15 packs of loins.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
all the packaging and the waste and
Exactly.
what happened to the rest of the animal.
Yeah.
You know, they
Mhm.
stop the bones, and you know, all of these sort of things that they do with that animal is you know, it's nose to tail eating,
Yeah.
and we want to showcase that through these farm to fork dinners.
Yeah. It sounds wonderful, and it's really customer led, and that's really, really important. I could talk to you for hours, but we only have a limited time today, so I just want to thank you for your time and say cheers.
Good health.
Cheers.
Sustainable wine.
Sustainable wine.
Sustainable wine.